Hi, this is part 3 of my mold making tutorial, and I'm Ron Cole, and in this part we're going to be trying to get this mold finished. The first thing I'm going to need to do is remove all of the clay and support structure that I placed around the sculpture in step 1. Well, one thing I want to point out before I start removing that clay is that this mold that I created in step 2 has been sitting for an entire 24 hours. And whenever possible, I like to let the plaster just cure for 24 hours before starting to make the second half, and that's for two reasons. Number one, of course, the plaster can reach its maximum strength, but actually, it's actually to make things easier because plaster heats up considerably while it's curing, and so all of the clay that you create that wall with gets very sticky, and you need to clean it all off. And unless you allow the mold to completely cure and cool before doing that, it's going to be very sticky. So I'm going to start removing that clay from the back half, and I just really need to peel it off. But I've got a collection of my fine sculpting tools that I'll be using to scrape off whatever tiny bits. And I've also got a paintbrush and a bottle of rubbing alcohol because I know that there's going to be little smears of clay and little spots that I need to brush it out of. I wouldn't use anything stronger in terms of a solvent than rubbing alcohol, because any solvent that gets onto your sculpture is going to soften up that clay and kind of flatten out the details. So now you don't need to be here for the entire boring cleanup process, but I just want to start removing this clay so you can see that when you peel off the clay, what you've got is a nice reproduction. Your little half spheres should just pop right out with the clay. And just be cautious not to damage your sculpture while you remove the rest of the clay dividing wall. During my cleanup process, when I find smears of clay caught along the surface details or along the seam line, just pull it off with a sculpture tool, and then usually I can just brush it away. Now, after having removed the clay, unfortunately, I've discovered that I've accidentally trapped some air pockets where I don't want them, but that's almost a good thing for you, so you can see how to deal with that if you get them. All I'm going to do is I'm going to fill the air pockets with some more plaster that I'll mix up, but it's actually very important before adding more plaster into a little air bubble to actually moisten it with water first, because if you try to take new plaster and add it on top of already cured plaster, it's going to cure almost instantly, and so it won't bond very well. So you need to moisten that area first with water so that it'll cure at a much slower rate and be able to seep into the surface. And after that sets up, you'll be able to smooth it off. Okay, the mold has been cleaned, and whatever little air bubbles I found have been patched with a little bit more plaster, and I'm ready for my next step. And my next step is to take some more thin sheets of clean clay. These, you might notice, I've angled on this edge, and that edge will be pointed in toward the sculpture. I'm going to add a thin line of clean clay all the way around the outer perimeter of the mold, leaving about a half an inch of space between this new line of clean clay and the sculpture. And I'll secure that, and also I'll make sure never to cover up any of these impressions left by the half rounds. Those are called mold keys, by the way, so if you ever hear that term, mold keys, that's what it means. And here's what that completed clay barrier looks like. I can spin it around here a little bit for you to give you a better look at the dimensions of it. And once again, I've avoided covering up any of my little mold keys. And also this outer barrier here, including this little well that I build at the bottom that goes down to the board, that's just to define the edge of the mold and keep it nice and flat. It's purely for the aesthetics. If you don't want to bother making this outer wall, the edges of your mold will be rough. You could file them off later. It's not a big deal. The last thing that I'll need to do before mixing up plaster to do my next layer is to take some petroleum jelly, and I need to cover up every bit of the exposed plaster in here. The clay wall, the sculpture, they don't need any. But the plaster most definitely does. That's what ensures that the two halves of the mold are going to come apart, because if there's no petroleum jelly or other type of mold release agent, they will not come apart. So very important. And after I add this release agent, I'll mix up plaster, and every step in making the second half of the mold is exactly the same as it is in the first half of the mold. So there's no reason for me to show you that part of it. The next thing you'll see in this is when this puppy is done and I open the finished mold. Once the second half of the mold has been completed, it's important to open the two halves evenly and slowly to avoid any cracking. I like to do that by adding stacks of popsicle sticks all around the edge, adding new sticks into the stacks and tapping them in, and gradually opening it. And as you do that, you'll feel it start to loosen up. After it feels loose enough to pull apart, take all those sticks out of there and start giving it a good yank. The detail surface on a new mold can be somewhat delicate, so use care when removing the original sculpture. And once you've managed to wrestle all of your clay out of your mold and get it nice and cleaned up, I had some sharp edges on here, which I just took a good strong knife and cleaned up the edges a little bit, just so your fingers are not getting cut up by sharp edges. You'll notice that there is a gap all along the edge here that's supposed to be there. I always like to have that so I can get some tools or fingers or whatever in there to be able to pry the mold apart. And if we can take a look at the inside, the most important part of your mold, you can see I'm really happy with the way this came out. I got nice reproduction on the detail, not too many little air bubbles. Something I also should have mentioned earlier is that when you need to fill little air bubbles that you might get in your mold, 5-minute liquid 5-minute epoxy resin or 20-minute epoxy resin dropped into the holes, that works really well too, because that adheres really well to the plaster surface and doesn't interfere with anything that you might cast into the mold. So you might want to consider that. So that's it. But I didn't forget. Got to tell you how to get rid of that plaster bucket. What you're going to do is you're going to take that bucket and do absolutely nothing with it for a couple days. All right, and just let the slimy sludge in the bucket all settle down till it's just a white mass on the bottom and you can see clear water on the top. That is safe enough to drain down your sink, but only the clear water part. Once you see the white stuff start to drain out of the bucket, thing to do at that point is just take that bucket and set it aside. And whether it takes a week or a month, you just let that sucker evaporate until there's just nothing but dried up crumbly plaster at the bottom. Knock that off into your garbage can and get rid of it that way. And other than that, I think we are done here. So I hope the tutorial was helpful, and happy mold making in your future, and cheers.